Well, hello, everybody. This is Aaron Marshall along with Corey Miller. Welcome back to this episode of Thoughtful Christianity. Again, we want to thank Utah Partnership for Christ. They're the ones that are making this opportunity for us. This episode. Let me try that again. That's pause. All right.
Take two.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody back to this episode of Thoughtful Christianity. This is Aaron Marshall along with Corey Miller. We want to just start off, as always, by thanking Utah Partnerships for Christ for making this radio show possible. Just their generous donations allowing us to do this, and we're excited to be back on the air. So, how you doing, Corey?
Hey, doing great, Aaron. Good to be back with you.
Woo! Yeah. Well, we've talked about in the first couple episodes of the show, we talked about the point of thoughtful Christianity. And Ratio Christi exists to change the culture on campus. So, our tagline, transforming lives on campus today, changing culture tomorrow. And
yes,
and so we wanted to talk about over maybe the next couple episodes, some ways in which the campus, maybe the campus culture has changed, and then the applications or the way in which that is kind of funneling out into society.
yes.
And I think one of the ways that is that we see that just blatantly today, where it's COVID times. I mean, all the things that are happening is the way in which we almost worship scientists in our culture today.
Yeah, it's not just believe the science, it's believe the scientist,
right?
Isn't it?
And I think the thing that we see a lot is this idea that scientists are the ones that are they're the ones that are just they have no presuppositions, they don't have a worldview, they're just following the data, and it's everybody else that is that is trying to impose their worldview on people. And that's a dangerous position to hold, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, we have exalted science as the be-all, end-all of knowledge, and so the authorities in our culture are the scientists on any matter, and everybody wants to be called a scientist.
Right. I mean, we look to Dr. Fauci right now for just to answer all of our problems, because supposedly with his level of expertise in science, therefore he can answer all of life's hard questions.
Right.
That just simply isn't the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're not demeaning science by just being honest about this. Science is very good. I mean, it's brought us so far in the world of development and technology, but I think we can overestimate or over rely or have an overconfidence, if you will, in science.
And what do you mean by that? Like, what in what ways do we overestimate what science can or maybe even cannot do for us?
Well, whenever you slap on an ism on a word, you're absolutizing that term, you're exalting that term in some respect. And so there's a difference between affirming science and affirming what might be called scientism. And so in our culture, for example, we demean certain aspects, like in the university, the humanities aren't looked on with as bright an eye as the sciences. And even then, you divide between the soft sciences and the hard sciences. And the closer you get to the hard sciences, the more exalted the position is. And way down the road, even not even allowed in the humanities hardly now is religion. And so we underestimate the role of faith and overestimate the role of science in our culture, to the point where we've really exalted science as the be all end all of knowledge in every category.
And this is what we wanted to talk about in this episode of the show, just the idea of scientism. Why don't you once you define scientism, you mentioned that term already. As Ratio Christi, like you said, we are not anti-science. In fact, we are adamantly pro good science, right. but we're against, so to speak, the idea of scientism. So maybe help the listeners understand the difference between those two.
Sure. Yeah. So scientism is the view roughly that whatever is not verifiable by one of the five senses is not a case of knowledge. It's the idea that only things derivable from the methods of science are the reliable ways to have knowledge of anything. A soft version of it would be it's the best way, but a hard version is that it's the only way, so that it excludes all other fields from thinking about science. So, one thinker, for example, Steven Weinberg, a physics Nobel Prize winner, said that the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done and may, in fact, be our greatest contribution to civilization. So there's an example of someone who really demurs and denigrates a field outside of science as worthy of knowledge and exalts science as the savior, essentially, of civilization.
And it's interesting because these are university professors. You know, Weinberg. You know, you had a debate where Alex Rosenberg came up at Purdue that you put together. He has a
Yeah,
similar view, you know, on materialism. But this is not the view that the universities have always had, right? I mean, in fact, we could argue that the universities were started by Christians with a better understanding, I'd say more correct understanding of faith and science.
right. I mean, Rosenberg, who we had at Purdue, he's the department head of philosophy at Duke University. He's a philosopher of science, and he's one that just candidly says that, you know, what is reality? It's whatever physics says it is. And he's an atheist. Like so many, like Weinberg before him, he exalts science to the point of scientism. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The universities um, were founded not with scientism or even science at the heart, but with the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth, and that truth was knowable. They were founded by Christians who were motivated and inspired by their Christian faith. They believed that central to the Christian faith was a knowledge tradition. As Jesus said, here is eternal life, to know God. Knowledge is central to the Christian experience. And so it's not just a fact of history, as like an accident of history, that the universities developed in the Christian West, including the subdisciplines of science. It's more connected to the essence of being explained by the Christian faith. Um, Jesus was called the Logos, or the logic of God. And if you look at all the subdisciplines of science, most of their founders were believers, like Mendel in genetics, or Pasteur in bacteriology, that's so prominent today, Kepler in astronomy, Linnaeus in taxonomy, Boyle in chemistry, Maxwell in electrodynamics, Newton in physics. The list goes on and on and on. Even the founder, I guess you might say the father of modern science, Francis Bacon, talked of the two books of God, God's word and God's work, scripture and nature, and the two can never contradict. Um, and so, when we look at even the history of Nobel Prizes in the last century, most of them were Christians who got Nobel laureates.
I mean, it was something like 60% of the Nobel laureates were Christians, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's significant.
Yeah, that's it's so and so. All right, so the pushback is going to be, and you know, I know that I mean, this is one reason which Ratio Christi exists, but the pushback is going to be, well, because all the things that you were talking about, that's more, that's you know, that worked in the Bronze Age, but now we've got science, and we've got a you know, science has disproved all of, you know, religion and all these other things, and that's why we have to trust the science, so to speak. So
Hmm.
you know, I know when that's a, you know, that's a 10-day discussion, but how, you know, what would be just a quick response to that in regards, because we mentioned Jesus, you know, we got a Christian faith, but you know, the idea is that science has shown that all these things are not true.
Yeah, well, so science hasn't shown that these things are not true, but scientism may have. But scientism is not science. Scientism is a certain philosophy of science. It may well be an atheistic philosophy of science. And as such, it's an education stopper, not starter. So, one can understand why we've come to have so much confidence in science when we look at the development of, technology and the explosion of information. Science is a very, very good tool, but it has to know its limits. The practice of science is not done in a vacuum. It's done within the context of a worldview, and people bring that to the table when they're practicing science. It's not as if the scientist puts on his or her white lab coat and just tests, does their measurements and gives us objective facts without anything else, as if what they give us are at the level of geometric proofs. It's not. Science cannot prove anything to be true. Science is incapable of that, and it's in part because it's based on inductive reasoning, which gives us, at best, probabilistic conclusions, never certainty.
So when people say science has disproven religion, all these other things, they just don't understand science.
Right. They don't understand the nature of science, and they don't understand the history of science, and they don't understand the internal limitations of science and the presuppositions that go into supporting science.
Right. And I want to let's talk about those for a second, but really what you introduced the term worldview, and
Hmm.
there's multiple people who've written on this, but they would say that the real issue is not between science and faith, right? The real issue is between worldviews, the supernatural versus the natural. And like you said, that some of these atheistic scientists are presupposing atheism and then trying to baptize that within their science, right? And this is where we get the idea of scientism, the idea that science is the only thing that can
Right.
explain reality when we just know that's not true.
Yeah. I mean, if naturalism or atheism is true, then the way that we know about reality has to correspond in some way to that. We're not going to get revelation because naturalism is true. There is no God. So how will we know? Well, we'll know through some physical way because everything's reducible to chemistry and physics. And so our understanding of the world has to be explainable in terms of chemistry and physics. It's got to be tested by the five senses. But again, uh, even then, if that's what we're left with as the only source of knowledge, we can never, through science, attain certainty in anything. And there are certain things that science can simply never know.
Right. So let's talk about some of those philosophical. So well, you mentioned there's limitations of science, and we need to recognize that, right? It's again we're not there. Science can't prove anything because you said it's like you said it's based on inductive reasoning. But so even then, all we're getting is probabilistic, which is
Uh-huh.
fine for some things. But then by definition, it can't disprove certain things. And we would say like certain claims like God exists or Jesus rose from the dead wouldn't in and of themselves be scientific claims, right? Those would be philosophical or historical claims and would use
Historical.
different methods to try to figure out the answers to those questions.
Right. You're never going to be able to take a microscope or a telescope of any magnitude and discover or refute God's existence.
Right.
Those have got to be done in different ways. There are
Right.
different ways of knowing.
Right, different ways, and that's right. And so we want to keep, so science is awesome as long as it stays in its lane. Scientism tries to make the entire highway based on
Yeah.
science, and it doesn't work. What are some of the philosophical assumptions that underpin science that you could argue that science itself can't prove, but just has to assume in order for people to actually do science?
Yeah, there are many. I'll give about four.
Okay.
One is that the scientific enterprise itself assumes that nature exists in a mind independent way. That means apart from our perceiving it, it is what it is without us looking at it, discovering it, making statements or thoughts about it. But then the question there is, how do you know that what we're seeing represents reality? How do we know, as the French philosopher and founder of geometry, Descartes, said, how do we know we're not deceived by an evil demon or in a dream state? We've often woken up. I know you probably have. I know I have. but you wake up from a dream and you're wondering, am I still in that dream or am I awake?
Right.
And you're wondering if you need to apologize for something you just did, or wondering, did I not really do that? Is this a dream? How do we know we're not in the dream state now? We don't know that, or that there's, to use modern vernacular, there's a super scientist with our brain in a vat, and he's plugging our brain with electrodes, giving us a sense of virtual reality, which is to say, not reality. We don't know that for certainty. That could be the case. We believe it, and most of what we believe is a complex of faith plus reason or belief plus evidence. But the fact that nature exists, that there is a world out there independent of my mind, is something of a philosophical presupposition. There are reasons to believe it,
Right.
but we can't just assume it. Science assumes it because it takes a certain view about reality. Second is that
Hold on,
nature,
Corey. Let me just.
yeah,
So what you're saying then is science can't prove that, but it must assume it. Or we say science, we really mean scientists, right? Doing science,
right,
but they can't prove that with the scientific method. But they have to assume it in order to do their science and to figure out if that is true. If we are in the matrix, or there is this evil genius.
right.
That's a philosophical question, and we would use different tools to understand than we would the hard sciences, and that's fine. It just means that science itself can't even help us understand that question. We have to use some other tool of knowledge to figure that out, right?
Right. We simply take these things for granted.
Right.
It's so commonsensical, we might say, but it is worldview dependent. Not every worldview is going to support that viewpoint as easily. So these things are philosophical presuppositions outside of science that scientists who practice it, as you showed, are relying on to get off the tarmac to do their investigation.
Right. Okay. So what's two or you so you got two or three more of
Yeah.
those presuppositions that we could quickly hit on.
Yeah. So nature's not chaotic, it's an intelligible order that can be known. So we would say that there is truth. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. A statement is true if and only if it squares with the way things are. And not only is there truth, but it can actually be known. Um, but once we start to dig into this, first of all, you're thinking about an intelligible order in nature. Certain worldviews, once again, certain philosophical assumptions, ways of viewing the world before science, either underwrite this or undermine this. Why should the world be intelligible? What assumptions might exist for that to be the case? Well, when we, you know, looked in the heyday of modernism, we came to the faithful conclusion that all is matter. That's a worldview, materialism. But what Einstein discovered is that below matter is energy, EMC squared. And then since then, what we've discovered is that underlying energy is information. And so at bottom in the world is mind, not matter, which is explained best by a worldview that has mind at its center, not matter. And either pantheism has that or theism has that. But atheism, materialism lacks that. And then, so that's, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and so basically what you're saying is you almost, in order to assume, in order to make the arguments for science that God doesn't exist, you need God to exist to undergird that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in just a minute we'll get to something on that, which the atheist is really tongue tied or mind tied because of his worldview and certain assumptions he makes, where
Yeah.
knowledge is a real problem there.
Well,
So yeah, so third is that it assumes the existence and applicability of the laws of logic, which are central to rational thought. But this is a category, again, of philosophy. We would take the laws of logic as something like invariant abstract entities that are, and they may be abstract, entities that are true for all people at all times and all places. They're things that I can be absolutely certain of. I can't be so in science, but in logic, I can be. But again, this is a category of philosophy, not of science, and yet the scientist uses things like the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, the preconditions of rational thought. These things the scientist uses and assumes are real and applicable to all of reality. But that's not the case for everyone. The Eastern thinkers in Buddhism and Hinduism, and just the average person in the East, might have a different view of this. So the assumption makes sense on certain worldviews, but not as much on others.
Yeah. Right. So we've got the laws of logic, and again, science, presupposes those things. And then lastly, as we're kind of coming towards the end, there's this really interesting presupposition that I think that, like you said, actually undermines all of the sort of certainly the Darwinian naturalistic evolutionary view. And so maybe just speak about that for a minute.
Yeah, this is the assumption about the reliability of our senses or our sense perception. We again take this for granted, but it's a philosophical assumption. There's no way, if a skeptic challenged either an atheist or challenged a Christian theist with the reliability of our sense perceptions, there's no way we could refute that skeptic, not the atheist or the theist. You can rebut him or her, but you cannot refute him or her. The best you could do is come up with a track record argument that my senses were reliable yesterday. Well, how do you know? Because they were reliable the day before. Well, how do you know that? Ad infinitum ad nauseum, all the way back. Um, we assume that this is the case, but if scientific naturalism is true, how do we know that our senses are reliable? And in fact, how do we know that they're not aimed at survival rather than truth? I mean, that's the whole Darwinian paradigm, is that things are governed by the survival of the fittest. Well, you can think of certain illustrations where having a false sense of perception, depth perception, for example, would help with survival. If you had a bad sense of depth perception, like I do, found that out when I was applying to go to the military, you realize that, or you come to think that a lion in the jungle is 100 yards away, when in fact maybe it's a mile away. Well, if you have that false sense, you're going to flight, you're going to run a heck of a lot faster and survive than someone who, had more of an accurate sense. Um, but what's worse for the naturalist or the atheist who embraces also evolution is that it undermines our ability to have knowledge about not only naturalistic evolution, but about any beliefs. And so Alex Rosenberg, that I had here at Purdue, said natural selection sometimes selects for false beliefs and sometimes even selects against the acquisition of true beliefs. Why? For the sake of survival. So that creates a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the idea is, and C.S. Lewis has written about this. Alvin Plantinga have written about it. But the idea is, if naturalistic evolution is true, you shouldn't believe naturalistic evolution is true. In fact,
Yeah.
you shouldn't believe anything is true, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because if I evolved purely naturalistically, then my mind evolved. If my mind evolved, my logic and reasoning evolved. How do I know it evolved correctly to give me views about reality? How do I know I'm really here? I think, therefore I am.
that's right. Well, we only got about a minute and a half left. Let's. There is also one sort of just destroying factor for scientism, right? And that's just the idea that it's actually self-refuting. So maybe we just
Hmm.
kind of this idea that science can explain everything. We'll talk about that for just a second.
Yeah. So if scientism is something like the view that only things that can be known to be true are that which is or are testable by science, by verification, maybe by the five senses, well, that statement itself is not verifiable or testable by the five senses. It's not take it away from the sentence. It's a statement. It's a proposition. You can't touch it. You can't taste it. You can't smell it, hear it, or anything like that. And so the very notion of scientism is self-defeating. It can't support itself, much less anything else.
Right. And so just as we quickly wrap up, what should we do with all this information? Where do we go from here?
Well, we go to truth, and we go to the one who is truth. Jesus is truth. The former atheist Cambridge thinker C.S. Lewis reminds us that, quote, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And so our culture became scientific because of the knowledge of God, not contrary to it.
That's right. Well, a lot of information. I hope that was helpful for y'all. Please let us know if you've got other ideas that we can talk about on this show. You can always email us at info@ratiochristi.org. For Corey Miller, this is Aaron Marshall signing off. Thoughtful Christianity. This is Ratio Christi, transforming lives on campus today, changing culture tomorrow.